copy of today's slides. So I think we can just kickstart today's session. My name is Mario Kiriakou. I'm co-founder here at Ratio. I'm not going to talk anything about us because I want to focus on today's subject. We've got half an hour, so quite a short period of time, but I think we've got quite a lot we can cover within that time. And the topic of today's presentation is something which is quite close to our hearts as an agency, because we see this as something we talk about regularly, but it's also triggered by all the conversations that we have with clients, not just in the legal sector, but professional services generally and B2B as well, is basically any type of organization that is looking to deliver a super tailored, highly optimized, and we're talking today specifically around, website digital experiences, but focusing primarily on that website experience that most of your prospective customers and clients engage with you on a daily basis. Next slide, please, Anne-Marie. Over the last month, I've been speaking to a lot of people, a lot of it triggered by today's session, but also just a lot of it with our day-to-day work, just detailing what are some of the challenges people are facing. Now, these might seem abstracted from today's topic around, how do you deliver an optimized website experience? But as we talk through today's session, I think you'll begin to see how a lot of these form part of the, barriers and stumbling blocks which prevent organizations, prevent firms from delivering that type of experience. So the first one is, having a one-size-fits-all approach to that client engagement, that client experience. And this isn't something which is unique to professional services firms. I think lots of organizations have this approach, especially organizations where you have lots of different practice areas, you have different services that you sell, you target lots of different markets. So you can have, from a client's perspective, an awful lot that they could potentially transact with you as an organization, but their specific needs are perhaps tailored around one or two tailored areas. But in terms of the experience they receive, it is, regardless of who you are, it tends to be the same experience, regardless of location, interest area, or how long they've been a client with you. The second one, and again, this is I think probably a universal truth for lots of organizations, is not having the data at hand to show the impact that marketing and digital has in, I suppose, supporting your business's revenue generating ambition. So are you able to put your hand on your heart and say, what percentage of the pipeline did marketing help support or drive at top of funnel? The other one is busy teams. And they tend to be, regardless of the size of your organization, whether it's small or large, they are smallish teams in the context of the type of work you need to do. So it's very difficult if you're looking to take a step back and figure out what that ideal client experience can look like. How can you optimize your website if you are busy on the day-to-day tasks, working on business as usual stuff? It's very difficult to find the bandwidth to do more. And one that came up on a survey actually on LinkedIn as well recently, disconnected technology stack. Most organizations will have lots of different tools. You have a bunch of different systems, content management systems, CRM systems, email platforms. Regardless of what platforms, what systems you have a bunch of different things which may be or may not be connected. Even if they are connected, there perhaps is limited in terms of the type of data that's being shared between systems. And obviously, as we talk through today's presentation, some of this stuff will begin to make sense in terms of why these challenges are some of the stumbling blocks to delivering an optimized website experience, but also some of the areas that need to be addressed in order to create that experience. Next slide, please. And this isn't rocket science. It's pretty obvious that when you look at your Google Analytics, you get an idea, a flavor of the sheer volume of visits and sessions that are being created each month. And each of those sessions is an individual with individual research needs and requirements, and they are primarily there to taken action, whether it's an immediate transactional need that they require support with, or perhaps it's been triggered by some thought leadership or content that you've put out there, and it resonates with them because it's an area of their lives or business that they are struggling with day to day. But they're there to take an action. Whether that action is something hard, like completing a form to speak to someone in business development, or it's something far softer around just the consumption of content, they're there to take a visible action. But it's hard to know from the marketer's perspective when looking to design that experience what actions people are looking to take. And of course, if you don't know what actions people are looking to take, it's very difficult to then define what that optimal experience should look like. The next slide. And this is a stat I came across. I think a colleague of mine put together an article a couple of months ago, and he shared this with me. And again, this is something which I identified this for law firms, but again, it kind of speaks to the majority of businesses that we end up talking to is there's a lack of personalization. And when we talk about an optimal experience, we're talking about, from my perspective, is how we can understand who those visitors are, who your clients are, and what they're interested in. And it is something which is, I think, a universal truth. I think part of the reason is it speaks to those small, busy teams. It speaks to organizations not knowing where to start, how to start. Perhaps it's a part of it's an understanding or lack of understanding around what technology you need to have in place to enable, or understanding the use of technology you have in place. As part of today's session, we have about 100 oddish people signed up for today's webinar, and I spent the last week or so going through people's websites just to compare, setting up an incognito mode, identifying some of your campaigns, clicking through on different links just to see the type of experiences I would get and see the type of information that was being tracked. And again, it feels very much, regardless of how I was approaching my interaction with organizations, it would be a similar type of content and material I would experience. Next slide. Okay, before we progress any further, question, I suppose, for the audience today to ask themselves, when looking to optimize the website experience, there's two questions to ask. One, are you approaching this in terms of a full design, which is, I suppose, the relatively common point of view, where every couple of years, perhaps look to do a full refresh of your website, new designs, new look and feel, and new navigation, new IA, just generally a new approach, and then you kind of set it, and obviously you might do some incremental changes over time, but then what you're really building up towards is that third year, every 3 years, a big capital investment around full design. The second one is, are you looking to optimize what you currently have, which ironically, I think my experience is the less common approach, but it is the approach which is from a budget investment point of view is more cost effective. It means it's more aligned with just incremental improvements over time and benchmarking against hopefully the type of KPIs which we're going to talk about later on. So the question is, if you're looking to do optimize your website, from what angle are you approaching this? Because it changes very much the perspective of how you would approach your own internal projects in terms of optimization. Next slide. I've put this in as a myth, but I mean it's a bit of a tricky one. So designing an optimal website is all about what the client sees, and I say it's a myth just to provoke, I suppose, questions really from the audience. From a client's perspective, their interaction with you digitally is I suppose, the customer experience layer that they will interact with on a daily basis, whether it's the emails they receive, the campaigns that they interact with, the site content that they visit and consume. That's what they see. But I always like to equate this when we speak to our own clients with the iceberg, that the clients, your prospective customers, will experience the tip of the iceberg, which is the I suppose digital layer that they interact with. But the reality is, from your perspective as the marketing team, trying to define and design that ultimate optimal customer experience for them, it's everything that sits behind it. So it's the processes, it's understanding what marketing systems you have in place, understanding what data you have on your customers, where that data sits. It is mapping that out. It is figuring out what KPIs we need to be tracking in order to define whether we're delivering a good experience and to put a baseline for what is a good experience from the perspective of our clients and those individual visitors. Next slide. And this sounds strange. Like, I want to talk about now that if we're looking to optimize the online experience, we need to focus on the offline experience first and understanding that. And the reason why it sounds strange when you say it straight away is because, well, this is a presentation around, how do I deliver a highly optimized website experience for our clients? Shouldn't we focus purely on the digital side? And I say yes, but also no. From my perspective, what we're looking to do is understand how your clients interact with you offline. Because at the end of the day, within a B2B organization, you have digital bringing in prospective customers, and you have partners, you have business development closing those relationships. And typically, what we want to understand is, what does the offline experience look like? How does your offline team interact with your clients? And I think when you begin to investigate that, you will see that partners and practice heads will engage with their clients, will begin to understand their clients' day-to-day challenges, they will understand their needs from them as an organization, and they could build up I suppose, more robust picture around what type of services they need to put in place, what type of relationship they need to put in place in order to make it a profitable relationship with that client on an ongoing basis. And the reason why I say we need to focus on understanding the offline experience first is because a client stays with a firm because there's obviously elements around cost and great service, but they stay with you because they feel it's they're getting the right level of service, because it's still very much a relationship driven, service oriented organization. And what we want to do is kind of create like that's a similar digital concierge type service online. So we want to understand why a customer would love working with you as an organization, and figure out how we can get as close as possible to replicating that type of experience online. Someone offline would recommend advice based on speaking to the client first, understanding their needs, and suggesting something. Well, digitally, there's no reason why we can't do the same in terms of listening out for what the client is interested in terms of content and information, and then delivering something which is highly targeted and relevant for them. Next slide. It's not unusual to hear feedback from marketers in professional services within the legal sector, where they've heard feedback from perhaps the business development, perhaps from partners, where there's a lack of understanding around the role marketing and digital plays in supporting the business. There's a disconnect. And I suppose in one sense it makes sense, because a client will interact with you through dozens of different touch points. But what gets remembered is the end of funnel conversation, which typically happens with an individual. And it's obviously much easier to, if that's being tracked within CRM systems, and obviously you've got individuals sharing that information, to say that a relationship is being driven by offline conversations. That's where the impact it resides. That is who should get the credit for driving this. And I think it obviously does a disservice to digital. It helps drive a lack of investment within digital, and a lot of it is because the top of funnel part isn't as well tracked, or it's more difficult to track. And therefore it's hard to then build a holistic 360 view of where marketing played a part in engaging and nurturing this prospect over time. I don't think marketing should ever lay claim to we brought the business to a firm. That's not the case, but it's a symbiotic relationship. Offline requires online to nurture those prospects. Unless someone's had a recommendation from someone, we work on the assumption that we need to market, build relationships, nurture prospects over time. And that is hard to track in many instances, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. But it's easy to see why the offline takes a lot of the credit for driving business within an organization. Next slide. So how do we go about digitizing the offline relationship? We talked about what the offline relationship could look like. Obviously, every organization will be different. So my suggestion is always to map out the process yourself. But then how do we begin to take that online and create that, I suppose, that kind of digital concierge type experience I mentioned earlier? Next slide. I always say we should start by building a single profile on your client, and a single profile that builds a holistic view of everything you know about that customer. And I think the simplest way to say this is to equate it with the offline relationship. Is in most B2B organizations, you have a CRM system. Whether you're using that CRM system well is a topic for another day. But typically, you'll have a CRM system, you'll have accounts, you have contact records, you have teams mapping and tracking and writing down everything that they need to know about that client, from the type of services they might be interested in, the type of decision makers, timelines, etc. Next slide. And the reason why I always think the CRM analogy is perfect, because it's true. That's what a CRM is there for. In most organizations, it tends to be the system of truth for a business in terms of tracking pipeline and tracking sales. But in terms of what we want to deliver digitally, we kind of need to do exactly the same thing. We want to build the CRM record for digital, because it's that record that's going to give us the information points to begin to understand what good experiences will look like for your clients, how we could tailor that experience, and then later on how we could begin to scale it. And very simply, just like a CRM record card, we want to know about your clients. We want to know what marketing campaigns they interact with, what were the content that drew them in, what content are they consuming on your site, are they triggering any goals, are they completing things like forms, are we tracking their type of sectors they're from. It will be different for different organizations, and I'm obviously happy to talk about this offline. Again, there's the dream scenario of what you want, and there's the how do we get there, and that's a topic for another day. But in its essence, it's how can we begin to track what we know currently on a client within a single profile view of them. Next slide. So why a single? Why a single profile? So next slide, Anne-Marie. Well, I think because it's I suppose its simplest really is that within most organizations, the systems that are used on a day-to-day basis that track that engagement and relationship with a client are completely separate to what marketing tends to use on a day-to-day basis. You might at pinch have access to a CRM system for things like lead management if you're using things like Salesforce or Interaction. But it's still very much a divide. Marketing will have its own platforms, its own systems that it uses, but the real data that's being held on clients is held elsewhere. And there's a disconnect. And obviously that disconnect creates a barrier. It creates a barrier from building up that picture on that client and trying to deliver that experience. So next slide. And there's nothing wrong with having different systems. Um, there's always trends within the marketplace. There was obviously trends within organizations to build, one single marketing platform to do everything and have all data. It's going back the other way now with customers looking to have, best of breed, tools that are do something super well. Um, but irrespective of having one system or multiple systems, you're always going to have data on clients held in disparate spots. It's held here, it's held there. And the problem with that is it's not shared. And I don't mean not being shared by individuals, it's not being malicious. It's just that data isn't being shared in a way that allows you to then influence that experience. I suppose if we're looking at it from the perspective of your marketing funnel, to influence the client's top of funnel experience, or even the whole experience, really, regardless of whether they're a prospect or a client. I would say the simplest way to position this is to say, as a marketer, are you able to define which visit to your site is from someone who's an existing client or someone who's a prospect? And it's a simple question to ask, but it's actually incredibly hard to define. And a lot of that is because the information that say defines if someone is a client is held elsewhere. And so simple to ask, hard to answer. But if you can connect the dots, and you can treat someone who's at base level, who's an existing client, differently from a prospect customer, it's quite a powerful way to develop that ongoing digital relationship. Next slide. I always say, when in terms of defining what traits we can track on a client, is after today's session, do a simple exercise. Look at the different and focus initially on your digital tools, your content management system, things like that, and look at what traits you can track. And look at the systems, look at what information is currently being tracked. But then obviously a question comes, where does it come from? So next slide. And it'll come from a bunch of different systems. So you look at your content management platform, whether you're using something like Sitecore or Episerver or Drupal, have a look at your CMS. Invariably, it will capture data on your customers. Look at your analytics platform. If you're using email platforms like things like Vuture, for example, have a look at the type of data that's being tracked within those systems. Do you have portals for clients and things like that? Map out the tools that you have and map out what type of data, what traits, what information, data points are being captured within those different systems, because it begins to give you a picture on what you actually know on your clients. And I think it's always a surprise when you do this exercise, the sheer volume of data that you actually currently track. And then the question is, we want to get it into a position that we can then do something positive with it. So next slide. Because ultimately, once we begin to identify those data points, understand what you got amongst all your different platforms, all your different systems, whether it's just 3 systems or 10 systems, it's almost irrelevant, really. It's that information is what creates the foundation of what goes into that single client view for digital to be able to build that idea of what a good experience looks like, because we then leverage that content to begin to deliver tailored experiences at scale for individuals based on what we know about them. Next slide. The question to ask yourselves is, what are your clients and prospects looking for when they visit your website? And again, this is one of those questions which is it's easy to ask, and actually once you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's actually very difficult to answer. Yes, you can look at things like Google Analytics to give you, I suppose, a flavour of what pages are popular, what people are kind of looking at. But if you was to ask at an individual level, it's very difficult to understand that. Next slide. And a question to ask yourselves is, as a marketer, if you was able to know what your what your prospects are looking at, what they're researching, what would you do with that information? What type of experience would you design for them? And I think it's important to take a step back, because sometimes it can. This is the point where people go, well, I've got, I don't know, for example, say 100,000 visits to our site each month, which might represent, say 100,000, unique prospects. That's just too much. And I say, yeah, it is if you take it from that perspective. But there's just break it down to just one individual person. If you was able to know what they was interested in, what sector, what type of practice area, what type of content that is, I suppose, top of mind for them at the moment, and then you was to redesign the whole digital experience around what you now know for that one person, what would that potentially look like? And I always say to start at that one person, because then we could take a step back, look at the data, see if we could identify perhaps segments where we could define, a different type of experience for them. But I always say start with one and ask yourself, what would you do with that information? And don't get too caught up for now in the sheer volume of the data that number of visits you get in each month. Let's start just very small. Next slide. And let's look at it from the client's perspective, because it's sometimes very easy to be inward looking in terms of designing the website experience, because it can become quite political. You have dozens of different practices, lots of different services that you provide. You have perhaps heads of those practice areas, and obviously they're interested in, I suppose, driving as much traffic and referral and awareness for their part of the business. And you kind of see that if you look at competitors' websites, you'll see clearly their information, their IA, their navigation is being built around their own internal approach to what they sell, instead of looking at it from the client's point of view. For when a client visits your site, they have a bunch of questions that they have in mind. One of them is always, do you as an organization understand my business, my unique business, perhaps where we sit in the market, understand what we need from an organization. Next slide. They will be looking for information around, they know what type of problems that they have. They want to understand, have you solved these similar problems for similar organizations? And they'll be looking for information around that. So, thinking about it, putting yourself in the client's shoes. And if you was that person going out looking for a new organization, new firm, what would you be looking for? The next slide. And clients are always going to think about it from their perspective, not necessarily the services you solve. They'll be focusing on the problems that they have. But then once they've, I suppose, feel comfortable that you're potentially the right type of organization, that they perhaps want to have a conversation or at least engage digitally with your content, they'll start looking at what your practice strengths are and try and figure out whether those align with the problems and day-to-day challenges that they have at the moment. So next slide. And then they want to define, who they want to speak to in a firm. So lots of companies will have a page for people, and they will have obviously the full breadth of everyone within the organization. You most probably have, search facilities for identifying at least a group of people. But obviously from the client's point of view, it's really hard to know who they should be speaking to, whether an individual has greater strengths or experience around their unique problems or challenges, and it's hard from the client's point of view to know that. So obviously you tend to just fill in the generic form, and of course that creates a delay in by the time you triage it and get it to the right person, it's not necessarily gone to the right person as quickly as possible. So next slide. And do you have the content which speaks to my daily challenges? And again, I think I always like to think about it from the multiple people you might engage with as a firm. You might be dealing with, company X, but you might be speaking to, say, 3 or 4 different individuals within that organization. A CEO will have different content requirements and different daily challenges to an in-house legal counsel. But each of those people might be a relevant person to be talking to. They might be the people you still deal with as an organization, but have you mapped their day-to-day challenges, and is your content speaking to those very separate individuals' challenges and needs? Next slide. Now, let's imagine if we had that single client profile where we built that view of your clients, we're capturing the data we want on your clients, how they're interacting with you as an organization, and we've thought about the experience from the client's perspective in terms of their type of individuals you'll engage with, the type of challenges they have, the type of business, the type of sector they're in, and reimagine that experience but built around that single client profile view. Next slide. Because it changes very much your approach to designing, whether you're looking to design a new website or you're looking to optimize what you have over time. It changes it because now you have the data information that maps out that client, and we can begin to map out what individual client experiences could look like for your different types of clients. Next slide. So what does a client personalized experience look like? Well, a highly optimized website experience will look very different for every single person on today's call, because even if you're within the same sector, you're not the same business as the person sitting next to you. You will have your own unique strengths, USPs. You will have things that you do that other people don't do, and things that you provide as an organization will separate you from your competition. And therefore, defining that experience is very much tailored to an individual organization and based around your client. But ultimately, what we want from this is, so next slide, Anne-Marie, is to begin to build out a tailored experience based on goals. Now, goals are not necessarily, the hard, fast, and what ideal type of goal that perhaps business development want, which is getting as many leads or form completions as possible. There's a lot of incremental goals that go up towards that, and when you think about it from the client's perspective, if every time they visit the site is to take an action, those actions are goals, and it's defining what those goals are and figuring out what the experience would look like if you knew the type of goals that were being triggered and the type of experience that sat behind that goal. And from when we think about an optimal website experience, it's kind of as simple as that, really. It's building up a goal map and building out the experience map that sits behind those goals, and then delivering those to clients through digital technology. And it's as simple as that, really. Now, the execution is not necessarily as easy, because we talked about at the beginning of today's session, small busy teams not having the bandwidth to think through what it could look like, not sure where to start. We always say you start very, very small and you build from baby steps onwards. So next slide. Because at its core, delivering an optimal experience is as simple as leveraging what we know about a client, what we hold on them, and using that to change up the experience. Now, it doesn't have to be done at first at scale. It doesn't have to be done for every single site visit that interacts with you as an organization. You can start with a small group, but the point is to treat it as a journey and start small. And by starting small, we mean by just do something with the information even if it's as simple as having a more robust segmented email nurture program. That's fine. If you're using a client profile view to build more targeted email marketing, that's a win. That's somewhere to start. Again, it's just to look at how we can deliver more relevant marketing experiences. Next slide. And this is a little bit unfair, set and forget. But it's because I say this because it's, I suppose, born out of experience on my side. Is people create this website experience, they spend a lot of money, great design, a lot of work has gone into development, implementation, training teams on content editing. You get it out, and it kind of ossifies over time. You obviously add new content pieces. Perhaps you purchase another firm, so you add new practice areas, new practice strengths. But at its core, whether you looked at it, year zero and then year three, it's fundamentally the same type of experience. It's not changing. And the reason why I say it's better to look at it at optimal experience, optimizing the experience as incremental improvements over time, because ultimately you want to change it slowly. You don't. It's very difficult to do a big project and assume that's going to drive the value you want it to drive. So next slide. At its foundation, I think personally, I always say data is the foundation for continual optimization. you know, we need data, and we need data in a way that actually doesn't scare us or means we're drowning in data, but data that it's provided in a structured fashion that gives us insights and genuine actionable insights, so we can actually do something with it, not just stare at it and go, it's too much content, too much information. I'm not sure how we could begin to leverage this data. Next slide. So at the beginning, I mentioned challenges that I've been collecting over the last month or so. Um, and the question to ask yourselves: how do you currently track the impact of digital? And when I say the impact of digital, I'm not thinking of the softer, more vanity type metrics. I'm thinking about, can you track the impacts that digital has in terms of your business's revenue generating ambitions, or have you got an idea of how you want to get towards that, which is just as good? But can you answer that question? So next slide. And how are you measuring in marketing is generating impact on your website? What does it look, what are you able to answer the question what good looks like from the client's point of view, in terms of, in the context of each individual visit? Do we have the KPIs and data in place to say what is good and what is not? Next slide. And part of that is always with defining digital metrics. And again, this isn't to, I suppose, beat up any type of organization. It can be quite difficult to define, the type of things we want to measure that sit beyond just, I think, things like perhaps for harder metrics like form completions, or softer metrics like total number of visitors, are they going up, or bounce rates. But I always like to think backwards. Work with your business development and sales functions to figure out what their goals are, what are their key business objectives, and map them back against digital metrics, and figure out which are the digital metrics which help support those business objectives. And you end up having a picture of quite a few small micro metrics which help towards building up towards delivering these larger, bigger business objectives. So if you're talking about form completions, there might be 3 or 4 smaller metrics that sit behind that help influence the conversion to a form. So next slide. And another part of, and we talked about this earlier, that holds organizations back is systems not talking to each other. We need to connect your different platforms, your different systems, so you begin to share that data on your clients, because it will help us support, it will help us begin to define the impact that digital has. If we're beginning to create those metrics, it means we can follow them through the whole system, from digital activities around your digital platforms, from content management system for website, your email platform for outbound interaction, through to things like social advocacy tools for amplifying partners social reach, right through to the hard sales data in CRM systems. Next slide. And that kind of brings us today. It was a bit of a whistle stop tour. It's quite a, I mean, we could probably, I know personally, we could, each of these areas we could talk about for hours on each area. But in summary, if I was to say what you should do after today's session, the things you should think about: one, sit down with your team and map where your client's data is held and where it's sat. Write down the type of information that you currently are tracking on your customers. You'll find it's an awful lot. The next step is always figure out the gap between what you know about your client and what you want to know about your clients. What would you love to know about your clients that you're not able to track at the moment? Investigate what marketing systems you currently have. And just as importantly, investigate what their capabilities are, because sometimes it's quite a surprise what your systems are capable of in terms of the optimizing the client's experience, what they're capable of. Figure out investigate what else, how you're using them and what you could potentially be using them for. And as we mentioned just a moment ago, define digital metrics which align with your business goals. So that brings us to the end of today's session. My email's up on the screen. I know a lot of people got my emails from the last couple of weeks, but if anyone's got any questions which have been triggered by today's session, always happy to answer these. Just feel free to pop a question in the toolbar and I'll answer it in the next couple of days, or feel free just to send me an email after today's session. As I said today at the beginning, the session was recorded. So I'll send this in the next couple of days, and I'll send over also a copy of the slide. So again, thanks everyone for taking the time. I know people are busy nowadays, especially with lots of content to consume. But I genuinely appreciate everyone taking the time to join me today. Again, apologies for the slight delay in kickstarting today's presentation. So thank you for bearing with me. And that kind of brings us to the end of today's session. So enjoy the rest of the day, and hopefully speak to you all soon. Bye bye.